The journal changed everything. I found it tucked behind a loose board in my grandmother's attic, wrapped in cloth that smelled of lavender and dust. My grandmother had been dead for 3 months, and I was helping my mother clean out the house before we sold it. I never expected to find something that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my family. My mother had been acting strange since the funeral. She would stare at empty spaces for long periods, and she avoided going through grandmother's personal things. She kept making excuses about being too busy with work or too tired from grief. I thought she was just processing the loss in her own way. I had no idea she was hiding something massive from me. The journal was bound in dark leather, and the pages were yellowed with age. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, written in fountain pen ink that had faded to brown. I opened it expecting to find recipes or garden notes, the kind of mundane records that elderly people keep. Instead, I found entries that made my hands shake as I read them. The first entry was dated 43 years ago. My grandmother wrote about a decision she had made, a choice that would affect generations of our family. She wrote about my mother as a young woman, pregnant and unmarried, desperate for a solution to her situation. The father had abandoned her, and she had nowhere to turn except to her own mother for help. I read about arrangements made in secret, about money changing hands, about documents being falsified. My grandmother had connections in the hospital where my mother gave birth. She had friends who worked in the records department, people who owed her favors from years of community service and charity work. She used these connections to orchestrate something unthinkable. The journal described how my mother gave birth to twins. I had never known about a twin. The entries detailed how one baby was registered under my mother's name, while the other was given to a family that had been waiting for an adoption. The hospital records were altered to show only one birth, and the adoption was handled through private channels that left no official trace. I was the baby who stayed. My twin brother was given away to a family named Henderson, who lived 3 states away. My grandmother wrote about the pain of separating the babies, about my mother's tears, about the promise that this secret would never be revealed. She wrote about watching my mother struggle with the decision for years afterward, always wondering about the child she had given up. The journal entries continued for decades, tracking the progress of both children from a distance. My grandmother had maintained contact with the Henderson family through mutual friends, always knowing where my twin brother was and how he was doing. She wrote about his achievements in school, his graduation, his wedding, his children. She had watched him grow up from afar, never able to meet him or acknowledge his existence. I learned that my twin brother lived only 2 hours away from us now. He had moved closer to our area 5 years ago when his company relocated him. My grandmother wrote about the agony of knowing he was so close, about the temptation to reach out to him, about the fear of destroying the life he had built with his adoptive family. She had kept her promise to maintain the secret, but it had eaten at her for decades. The most shocking entry was dated just 6 months before my grandmother's death. She wrote about a chance encounter at a grocery store, about seeing my twin brother in person for the first time since he was a baby. She described how much he looked like me, how he had the same mannerisms and expressions. She wrote about following him to his car and memorizing his license plate number, about the overwhelming urge to approach him and tell him everything. She had restrained herself that day, but the encounter had prompted her to make a decision. She wrote about her failing health, about the doctors telling her she had limited time left. She decided that someone needed to know the truth, that the secret had to be preserved even if she couldn't tell it herself. She had hidden the journal where she hoped I would find it, trusting that I would know what to do with the information. I sat in that dusty attic for hours, reading and rereading the entries. My mind struggled to process what I had learned. I had a twin brother who had been living his entire life without knowing about me. My mother had been carrying this secret for over 4 decades, watching me grow up while always thinking about the child she had given away. My grandmother had orchestrated this entire deception and had lived with the guilt until her death. I thought about all the times my mother had seemed sad for no reason, all the occasions when she would look at me with an expression I couldn't understand. I remembered her reaction when I told her I was having twins with my husband. She had become emotional in a way that seemed excessive at the time, but now I understood why. She was thinking about her own twins, about the choice she had made all those years ago. I climbed down from the attic with the journal clutched in my hands. My mother was in the kitchen, sorting through old dishes and deciding what to keep. She looked up when I entered, and I saw the exact moment when she recognized what I was holding. Her face went pale, and she sat down heavily in one of the old wooden chairs that we had planned to donate to charity. I placed the journal on the table between us and waited for her to speak. She stared at it for a long time, her hands folded in her lap. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were filled with tears. She asked me how much I had read, and I told her I had read everything. She nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting this moment for years. She told me about the fear she had felt as a young woman, about the shame of being pregnant and unmarried in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. She described the father of her children, a man who had promised to marry her but had disappeared when she told him about the pregnancy. She had been alone and desperate, with no money and no support except for her mother. My mother explained that the decision to give up one of the twins had been the hardest thing she had ever done. She had wanted to keep both babies, but she couldn't provide for 2 children on her own. She had thought that giving one child to a family that could offer him a better life was the right thing to do. She had convinced herself that it was an act of love, not abandonment. She talked about the years of wondering and worrying, about the nights when she would lie awake thinking about her other son. She described the guilt of keeping the secret from me, of raising me while always feeling like she was betraying my twin brother. She had wanted to tell me the truth many times, but she had been afraid of how I would react and worried about disrupting my brother's life. I asked her if she knew where my brother was now, and she admitted that she had been keeping track of him through the same network of friends that my grandmother had used. She knew about his job, his family, his address. She had even driven by his house once, just to see where he lived. She had been tempted to contact him, especially after my grandmother's death, but she had been paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. We talked for hours that day, with my mother sharing details that hadn't been in the journal. She told me about the birth, about holding both babies for the few hours before one was taken away. She described the pain of watching my brother leave with his new family, about the promise she had made to never interfere in his life. She talked about the arrangements that had been made to ensure the secret would be kept, about the people who had helped make the deception possible. I learned that my brother's adoptive parents had been told that his birth mother had died in childbirth and that his father was unknown. This lie had been necessary to prevent any future contact between the families. My grandmother had thought that a clean break would be better for everyone involved, that it would allow my brother to bond completely with his new family without any confusion or divided loyalties. Over the following weeks, I found myself obsessing over the information I had learned. I looked up my brother online and found his social media profiles, his professional information, photos of his family. He did look remarkably similar to me, with the same facial structure and build. He had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who would be my nephew and niece. His wife seemed happy and loving, and their family appeared to be thriving. I struggled with the decision of whether to contact him. Part of me felt that he had a right to know the truth about his origins, that keeping him in the dark was a form of betrayal. But another part of me worried about the impact that this revelation would have on his life. He had been raised by loving parents who had given him everything he needed. He had built a successful life and a happy family. What right did I have to disrupt that with information that might cause him pain? I discussed the situation with my husband, who was sympathetic but cautious. He pointed out that my brother might not want to know about his birth family, that he might be angry about being contacted. He worried about the legal implications of the falsified documents, about whether revealing the truth could cause problems for the people who had helped orchestrate the deception decades ago. He suggested that I think carefully about my motivations before taking any action. I spent sleepless nights weighing the options. I imagined different scenarios, different ways of approaching my brother if I decided to contact him. I thought about writing a letter, about calling him, about showing up at his door. I rehearsed conversations in my head, trying to find the right words to explain a situation that seemed impossible to explain. I wondered how I would feel if I were in his position, if someone contacted me with similar news about my own origins. The decision was made for me in an unexpected way. I was at a conference for work when I saw a familiar face across the hotel lobby. It was my brother, attending the same conference for his company. He was standing in a group of people, laughing at something someone had said. The resemblance between us was even more striking in person than it had been in photos. Several people had already commented on how much we looked alike. I watched him from a distance for most of the first day, trying to work up the courage to approach him. He seemed confident and friendly, easily making connections with other conference attendees. I noticed that he had some of the same mannerisms that I had, the same way of tilting his head when he was thinking, the same gesture of running his hand through his hair when he was concentrating. It was eerie and fascinating at the same time. On the second day of the conference, we ended up in the same breakout session. The room was small, and we were seated only a few chairs apart. I could see him clearly, and I noticed that he kept glancing at me with a puzzled expression. At one point, he leaned over to the person next to him and whispered something, nodding in my direction. I realized that he was as struck by our resemblance as I was. During the break, he approached me directly. He introduced himself and commented on how much we looked alike, joking that people had been mistaking us for each other all morning. He asked if we might be related, if we had family in common. I felt my heart racing as I tried to decide how to respond. This was the moment I had been dreading and anticipating for weeks. I told him that I thought we might have more in common than just our appearance. I suggested that we get coffee after the conference sessions ended, that there was something important I needed to discuss with him. He agreed, though I could see the curiosity and concern in his eyes. He probably thought I was going to try to sell him something or ask for money. He had no idea that I was about to turn his entire understanding of his life upside down. We met at a quiet coffee shop near the hotel that evening. I had brought copies of the relevant pages from my grandmother's journal, along with some family photos that showed the resemblance between us and our shared relatives. I started by asking him what he knew about his birth parents, and he repeated the story he had been told about his mother dying in childbirth and his father being unknown. I told him that the story wasn't true, that his birth mother was alive, and that he had family who had been wondering about him for decades. I explained about the journal, about the secret that had been kept for over 40 years. I showed him the documentation that proved our relationship, the photos that showed our family resemblance, the evidence that connected him to our shared history.
Hope you enjoyed tonight's chilling Reddit tale. If it gave you goosebumps, smash that like button. We've got spine-tingling Reddit stories coming. Thanks for watching, and remember, choices made in fear define us. Until next time, sleep tight, if you can.